Hello students, welcome to the lecture on learning, and after the lecture we will be able to learn the following objectives. Define the characteristics of learning, explain the principles of learning, describe the conceptions of learning, define evolving theories of learning, explain the relationship between theory and practice, describe the different types of learning theory. Let's start with a brief introduction to learning. The ability to learn is one of the most outstanding human characteristics. Learning occurs continuously throughout a person's lifetime. To define learning, it is necessary to analyze what happens to the individual. Learning takes time and patience. It is a process, a journey. A self-directed learning process is arguably the most powerful model for facilitating and inspiring individual, group and organizational learning and development. In addition to formal theories, people hold personal theories, including theories of learning and teaching. Some typical questions such theories might involve are: how does one determine if learning has occurred? What factors determine whether or not learning occurs? Are these factors located in the environment or within the individual?
The question, how do you become really good at something? Well, I can't give a specific step-by-step guide for every single person on YouTube video because it's impossible. There's a basic learning approach that applies to anything. I'll provide the model, you fill in the blanks. It works for learning guitar, tai chi, business, chess, training your cat, anything. We'll go through the 5-step process. So learning any skill happens in a pyramid. Not the normal pyramid and not a food pyramid, but a pyramid broken into chunks, each chunk representing a smaller skill that is critical for becoming proficient in the overall task. Why the gap between chunks? Learning anything new generally doesn't happen linearly. The learning process isn't like standing on an infinite escalator, though that sounds really fun. When learning anything new, there are plateaus and places where you need to extend yourself and allow room for failure. You also can't learn everything at once, so you need to start with the core concepts and skills and work your way up from there. Let's take a look at an example of the learning process with playing guitar. When you first pick up a guitar, it's fun for about 2 minutes before you realize you don't know how to play any songs or chords. You then worry about annoying everyone around you. Playing the guitar doesn't become fun until you master the first chunk, which is generally learning basic chords, finger positions, or strumming. Here's the 5-step process to learning the guitar. Define a chunk of information to learn that is just outside your current capability. Since we're starting at the very bottom, it could be anything, but you want to start with the core foundation, so either notes or chords or strumming. 2, focus on mastering that one chunk, meaning you're not going to leap from learning the solo to Stairway to Heaven right away. You're sticking with that one simple chunk until you've internalized it. Number 3, practice deliberately. Notice mistakes when they happen and correct them instead of avoiding them or working around them. Focus on making things that are uncomfortable or you're not so good at a lot better instead of avoiding them. Number 4, repeat the process until you can perform the chunk with little to no conscious effort. This frees your mind to focus on more complicated skills and move up the learning pyramid. Number 5, determine the next chunk to master and start the process all over again. This might be learning scales, finger picking, advanced chords, improvising, or different techniques. You have to start the process all over again and find the next chunk that is slightly more difficult than the one you just learned. At each stage, you have to go through the feeling of being a little bit uncomfortable, going through that boring, possibly repetitive practice, and eventually internalizing the new skill. And then repeat the process all over again. You'll find this happens in no matter what the skill is. Robert Greene, in his book Mastery, which analyzed how people rise to the top of their field from Muhammad Ali to Albert Einstein, has a great quote from that book that describes this process. If we are learning a complex skill, such as flying a jet in combat, we must master a series of simple skills, one on top of the other. Each time one skill becomes automatic, the mind is freed up to focus on the higher one. At the very end of this process, when there are no more simple skills to learn, the brain has assimilated an incredible amount of information, all of which has become internalized, part of our nervous system. A whole complex skill is now inside us and at our fingertips. We are thinking, but in a different way, with the body and mind completely fused. We are transformed. So while I use guitar as the example, the process applies to learning anything. To summarize the process to learn any skill: 1. Determine the first chunk to learn. 2. Master that one chunk. 3. Practice deliberately. Mistakes are the feeling of plateauing are normal here. 4. Repeat the practice until you've internalized the skill. 5. Move on to the next chunk.
Let's discuss about the characteristics of learning. Learning process can be quite complex because, among other things, an individual's background strongly influences the way that person learns. To be effective, the learning situation also should be purposeful, based on experience, multifaceted, and involve an active process. Learning is purposeful. Each student sees a learning situation from a different viewpoint. Each student is a unique individual whose past experiences affect readiness to learn and understanding of the requirements involved. Learning is a result of experience. Since learning is an individual process, the instructor cannot do it for the student. The student can learn only from personal experiences. Therefore, learning and knowledge cannot exist apart from a person. A person's knowledge is a result of experience, and no two people have the same identical experiences. Learning is multifaceted. If instructors see their objective as being only to train their students' memory and muscles, they are underestimating the potential of this teaching situation. Students may learn much more than they expected if they fully exercise their minds and their feelings. Learning is an active process. Students do not soak up knowledge like a sponge absorbs water. Instructor cannot assume that students remember something just because they were in the classroom, the shop, or an airplane where an instructor presented the material. Neither can the instructor assume that the students can apply what they know because they can quote the correct answer verbatim. For students to learn, they need to react and respond, perhaps outwardly, perhaps only inwardly, emotionally, or intellectually. Now let's talk about the principles of learning. Readiness. Individuals learn best when they are ready to learn, and they do not learn well if they see no reason for learning. Getting students ready to learn is usually the instructor's responsibility. If students have a strong purpose, a clear objective, and a definite reason for learning something, they make more progress than if lack motivation. Exercise. The principle of exercise states that those things most often repeated are best remembered. It is the basis of drill and practice. The human memory is fallible. Effect. The principle of effect is based on the emotional reaction of the student. It states that learning is strengthened when accompanied by a pleasant or a satisfying feeling, and that learning is weakened when associated with an unpleasant feeling. Experiences that produce feelings of defeat, frustration, anger, confusion, or futility are unpleasant for the student. Primacy. Primacy, the state of being first, often creates a strong or almost unshakable impression. For the instructor, this means that what is taught must be right the first time. For the student, it means that learning must be right. Unteaching is more difficult than teaching. Intensity. A vivid, dramatic, or an exciting learning experience teaches more than a routine or a boring experience. A student is likely to gain greater understanding of slow flight and stalls by performing them rather than merely reading about them. The principle of intensity implies that a student will learn more from the real thing than from a substitute. Recency. The principle of recency states that things most recently learned are best remembered. Conversely, the further a student is removed time-wise from a new fact or an understanding, the more difficult it is to remember. Let's understand the conceptions of learning. Understanding any theory requires a clear idea of what a theory is trying to explain. When a particular word is used, people usually assume everyone has a common understanding of what the word means. Unfortunately, such is not always the case. In trying to understand the various theories of learning and their implications for education, it is helpful to realize that the term learning means different things to different people and is used somewhat differently in different theories. In many cases, the various theories are relevant to different types of learning and are not necessarily incompatible with one another. Rather, they provide different perspectives on the complex phenomena of learning, and they complement one another in their ability to explain different types of learning situations. Now, let's move on to the next topic, which is evolving theories of learning. The modern psychological study of learning can be dated from the work of Hermann Ebbinghaus, whose well-known study of memory was published in 1885. Other early studies of learning were like Edward L. Thorndike, whose dissertation on the problem solving was published in 1898, and Ivan Pavlov, whose research on classical conditioning was begun in 1899 but first published in English in 1927. The 1990s were dubbed the decade of the brain, and huge advances were made in neuroscience and how the brain relates to human behavior and learning. The study of how the brain relates to learning is in its infancy. An understanding of how the neurophysiology of the brain affects learning and cognition will add greatly to our understanding of human learning and have a large influence on further theories of learning. Nevertheless, a psychological component to these theories will remain critical for learning in educational settings. Education as it is presently understood is based on the psychological processes and the interactions that are capable of being influenced by instruction, and it seems likely that psychological interventions will continue to be an important part for the unforeseeable future. Let's now take a look on the relationship between the theory and practice. The relationship between theories of learning and educational practices is complicated by several factors. One would think that instructional practices should be based on the best theories of learning available, but this relationship is not as straightforward as one might think. Schools and educational practices are far more likely to be based on philosophical beliefs than on empirical studies and theoretical understandings of learning. A common belief is that knowledge flows from scientific theories to the development of effective practices, that sound theories of learning dictate effective educational practices. Science, however, does not always operate in such a linear fashion. In both the physical and social sciences, ideas often come from observing and questioning things that occur in the real world. Why did that apple fall from the tree? That led to his discovery of the three laws of motion. Modern-day conceptions of learning and teaching recognize that students are active, often proactive, participants in the learning process, even if they appear otherwise. This dynamic nature of the learning process is one reason why instructional interventions that appear the same to the teacher can result in very different student outcomes, and why rather different instructional methods can result in very similar outcomes. Now let's explore the different types of learning theory. There is little agreement on how many types of learning actually exists. Nevertheless, it should not be too difficult to identify the different types of learnings in the following examples. Learning to tie a shoelace or a necktie. Being afraid, fearful in a literal sense, to work in a math class after a lengthy public ridicule by a teacher 2 years earlier for being unable to explain a problem to the class. Understanding and explaining the causes of the French and the American revolutions. Learning to cook by watching one's father or mother. Negotiating and understanding of learning with a person holding a different theoretical perspective. Different theories are good for explaining one example, but poor for explaining other examples. cognitive load. As a result of the WM limitation, instruction should be designed so that WM is capable of processing the instruction, that is the information that constitutes the instruction. The instruction, because of its information elements that have to be processed as well as the way it is designed, imposes a cognitive load, CL, on a learner. For understanding to commence, the load should not exceed the capacity of the limited WM. Measuring cognitive load. Measuring CL can be done with several assessment techniques: subjective, physiological, and task and performance based. Subjective techniques are based on the assumption that people are able to assess the amount of mental effort they expended. Effects generated by central location test, CLT. The CLT research has led to the development of a number of instructional formats primarily meant to decrease extraneous CL. These have enabled freed up WM capacity to be used for effective learning, and therefore students have been conducted in which germane CL was increased when it was considered directly relevant to schema construction. Distributed cognition. Distributed cognition is most closely associated with the work of the cognitive anthropologist Edwin Hutchins at the University of California, San Diego, and with his students and colleagues. In his groundbreaking research, Hutchins studied the work of a navigation team on a Navy ship. The team used specialized tools and coordinated activity to accomplish more than could be done by any individual thinker. Material distribution of cognition. A cognitive task as mundane as multiplying two-digit numbers is rarely done in the head. Instead, multiplication commonly involves a written representation of the problem or the use of a calculating device. Social distribution of cognition. Through orchestrated group activity, humans accomplish tasks that would overwhelm any individual, while social institutions distribute labor and expertise across the groups, sustaining complex societies. From sports to science, nearly every human endeavor depends on the social coordination of the activity, whether among people in close proximity or widely dispersed in time and space. Temporal distribution of cognition. Human cognition incorporates products of past activity, distributing cognition over time. Environments for human cognition are highly artificial, crafted to support certain activities and riddled with representations. How distributed cognition differs from individual views of cognition. The cognitive revolution that led to the information processing psychology and artificial intelligence was founded on the idea that the mind, like a computer, is a symbol processing system. The senses transduce perceptual inputs into the symbols which are operated on by an internal logic engine, producing other symbols that are programs for action. Distributed cognition preserves the view that humans are users of symbols and that cognition is computation, but dispenses with internal symbol processing as the fundamental architecture of the cognition. Implications of distributed cognition for education. Because distributed cognition focuses on activity in real-world settings, most research has investigated learning in the context of work. Domains include ship navigation, fleet fishing, air traffic control, and commercial aviation. Despite the limited availability of classroom-based research, distributed cognition does offer a perspective on learning that can inform classroom instruction, both for mastering conventional systems and for supporting innovation. Dual coding theory. Dual coding theory is a general theory of cognition and mind. Dual coding theory has inspired much research and debate in psychology, and it has played a major role in stimulating a modern resurgence of interest in mental imagery and its role in mind. The basic principles of dual coding theory. The core ideas of dual coding theory can be stated succinctly. The theory assumes that cognition involves the activity of two qualitative different mental codes, a verbal code specialized for dealing with language in all its form, and a non-verbal code that is specialized for dealing with non-linguistic objects and events in the form of mental images. Applications and extensions of the dual coding theory. Perhaps the most productive application of dual coding theory has been to literacy. The theory offers empirically supported accounts of all aspects of literacy, including decoding, comprehension and response and reading, written composition and spelling, challenges and the controversies. Dual coding theory can be contrasted with theories which assume that all cognition has a common abstract code in the form of schemata or propositions. This metalized is assumed to be computational in nature, built into the brain like a computer's built-in machine code. Information processing theory. The IPM consists of three main components: sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. Sensory and working memory enable people to manage limited amounts of incoming information during the initial processing, whereas long-term memory serves as a permanent repository for knowledge. Working memory. Working memory is a term that is used to refer to a multi-component temporary memory system in which information is assigned meaning, linked to other information, and essential mental operations such as interferences are performed. Long-term memory. The role of long-term memory is to provide a seemingly unlimited repository for all the facts and knowledge in memory. A great deal of research has gone into identifying two key aspects of long-term memory: what types of information are represented and how information is organized. The implications for instruction. The information processing model provides four important implications for improving the learning and instruction. The first is that memory stores are extremely limited in both sensory and working memory. A second implication is that relevant prior knowledge facilitates encoding and retrieval processes. Highly effective learners possess a great deal of organized knowledge within a particular domain, such as reading, mathematics, or science. A third implication is that automated information processing increases cognitive efficiency by reducing the information processing demands. As discussed, automaticity is an important aspect of effective learning for two reasons. A fourth implication is that learning strategies improve the information processing because learners are more efficient and process information at a deeper level. All effective learners draw from a repertoire of learning strategies in a flexible manner. Did you know that dual coding theory originated in the 1960s to explain the powerful effects that mental imagery has on memory, and it has been extended since to account for increasingly more mental phenomena. Now in the end, let us summarize what we have learned in this lecture. Learning is one of the most important activities in which humans engage. It is at the very core of the educational process, although most of what people learn occurs outside of school. Associative learning is the process by which an association between two stimuli or a behavior and a stimulus is created. Cognitive load theory (CLT) can provide guidelines to assist in the presentation of information in a manner that encourages learner activities that optimize the intellectual performance. Dual coding theory is based on the common assumption of continuity between the perception and memory. The role of long-term memory is to provide a seemingly unlimited repository for all the facts and knowledge in memory.